Hello, and welcome to the Biomass Magazine podcast. I'm your host, Anna Simet. Hope you're doing well. For this episode, we are again turning to the topic of biochar, and for good reason. Our guest today is Myles Gray, Program Director of the U.S. Biochar Initiative. Myles, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Let's begin having you tell us a little bit about the USBI.
Yeah, USBI, we are a 501c3, so we're a nonprofit, and we focus on, broadly speaking, increasing production and use of biochar in North America. And, within that, there's a lot of ways we could do that. What we tend to focus on are essentially three pieces of that. The biggest one is that we focus on developing end-use markets for physical biochar. Biochar, there's a number of ways companies can make money in the biochar space. They can sell carbon credits. They can sell energy products. They can sell physical biochar, and sometimes they can get paid to take waste, like tipping fees. But our piece of that, really, what we focus on is developing markets for the physical product in agriculture, in construction, in materials, in environmental work as well. So that's one piece, is developing markets for the physical product. Sort of aligned goal that we work on is developing out standards for biochar. So this is very much aligned with markets. You can't really grow significant markets without standards. So standards are another thing we work on. We work on laboratory standards, end-use standards, and production standards. And then the final thing we do is we host the annual North American Biochar Conference, which is the biggest biochar conference in North America. And our next conference is coming up here in just under 2 months, September 15th to 18th in Minneapolis. So those are essentially the three things that we really focus on at USBI.
I will be at that conference as well.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Myles, how long have you guys been around for?
USBI has been around for over 10 years now. I think it was formally incorporated in 2015, so right around 10 years. And, at the beginning of that time, a lot of what USBI did was really just kind of building awareness. But as the market and industry have really grown, we've, as I said, kind of focused in on these three focus areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. So for those of our listeners who don't know, let's cover a little bit of the basics. Can you explain how can biochar be produced?
Yeah, biochar, it's a funny term because it refers to both a material and a process. So the material is a whole lot like charcoal. The primary difference is that biochar can't be used, you can't burn it. So instead of burning it to make heat for your grill, you're using it in a number of different products. And as I said, things like soil amendment, fertilizer products, construction products. Now, the process itself, essentially when you heat biomass, if you don't provide enough oxygen, it will turn, about half of the carbon will turn into charcoal, and the other half of the carbon will turn into these vapors. So that's essentially how biochar is produced. You're producing it through a process called gasification or pyrolysis. And you end up with about half the carbon in biochar, and half the carbon can be combusted in these vapors to make energy products. But you can essentially make biochar from any biomass product. You can make it from wood chips, from bark, from rice hulls, from peach pits, manure, biosolids. You can make it essentially from any type of waste biomass.
Is the crud in the bottom of my oven that keeps baking, is that considered biochar?
Oh yeah, I guess you could consider that biochar if you had a good end use for the product. You could maybe consider that to be biochar.
Okay, well, thanks for that explanation, Myles. So biochar's origins go back a long way. Why is it gaining so much attention today?
Yeah, it does. So it goes back all the way to sort of ancient Amazonian tribes were using biochar to improve this soil in the rainforest. And it was used in agriculture, for thousands of years. I think it's been rediscovered mostly because there is interest in carbon removal credits. So these are essentially avoidant or offset credits. So companies are buying these credits to help meet their climate targets. So some of the companies that are doing this the most are mostly US-based tech companies, companies like Microsoft and Google and others. So that's really injected quite a bit of money into the biochar space, and that's really led to this kind of renaissance of the industry is the availability of these significant payments for making carbon removal credits.
Okay, that's a good segue into my next question. Tell us more about that. What are the economic opportunities with biochar and carbon removal credits?
Yeah, so the starting point is you can make carbon removal credits from biochar projects. It has to be waste biomass. So you can't go cut down trees intentionally to make biochar, but I would contend that nobody would ever do that anyway because the economics simply wouldn't work. The biochar really only works if you're getting a waste biomass. So there's not really a whole lot of risk there anyway, but that is one of the rules around these things. Is you can only use waste biomass. So, essentially, as long as you comply with some of these rules that are in these carbon methodologies, you can generate these carbon removal credits. And what it is a third party will pay you for converting waste biomass into biochar. And, as an example, wood biochar, right now, these carbon removal credits for biochar are selling for about $150 to $180 per ton of carbon dioxide. So that's a pretty good amount of money. And when you actually translate that into the value for wood biochar, there's a multiplier. So each ton of wood biochar represents about 2.5 tons of CO2. So you're actually in close to about $400 per ton of wood biochar is the amount of revenue you can generate from these CO2 credits. So it's a pretty significant amount of money. And one of the interesting things is that most biochar companies today they're decoupling that credit from the physical product. So they're able to sell the credit to, let's say, Microsoft, and then they can sell the physical biochar separately. You can't double count that carbon removal piece, but you can sell the physical biochar to a farmer or to a potting media company, and you can sell that separately from that CDR credit.
Wow, interesting. Okay, so what are the major markets for biochar right now? Tell us more about those.
Yeah, in the physical space, the major markets are, historically, soil amendment has been the kind of number one market in the biochar space. And we continue to see that in the United States. And there are some federal programs through USDA, the Department of Agriculture, that provide cost share incentives for farmers to use biochar. So some of those are a little bit uncertain right now. A lot of stuff in the federal system right now. It's hard to know what's happening. There's a little bit of turbulence, but we expect that will clear up pretty soon, and that program will move forward. And we do a lot of work in that space. Beyond soil amendment, we as an organization, we focus on 5 markets that we really put a lot of effort into. So first is soil amendment. We also focus a lot on potting media and substrate. So this is companies like Scott's, but also big nursery companies that sell potted plants. And they use a lot of peat and a lot of perlite, which are these really great growing materials, but they're pretty expensive and they have some pretty high carbon emissions from using them. So that's one, is using biochar as a substitute for those products in potting media. Another one we work on a lot is using biochar in environmental remediation and stormwater treatment. So biochar can act a lot like activated carbon. It can remove a lot of pollutants. Another one we work on a lot is concrete. So there's a lot of concrete companies that are really interested in using finely ground biochar in concrete products. And then the final one we work on is using biochar in fertilizer products. So working with different fertilizer companies to use, again, ground up powdered biochar in fertilizer products. And mostly what it's doing there is to help improve the efficiency of nitrogen fertilizer.
What a versatile kind of magical product. That's amazing. So many different uses.
I agree. I just want to point out it's not magic, but it is mysterious.
Science. Yes.
Yes, it is sciencey. And it's an interesting space to be in because there's so many different ways you can go with this material. Luckily, we just brought on a new director of agriculture, Tara Lewandowski, who's going to be really great. She just started this week, and she's really going to turbocharge a lot of our work in the agriculture space.
Oh, very good. So, Myles, do you have any estimates as to how much biochar is produced and sold in the US every year? I imagine that's probably hard to track.
It is hard to track. We made an effort at this 2 years ago. So in the fall of 2023, we did a survey. It was a global survey, but we did a lot of focus on the US market. And what we found in that survey was that there was at least 200,000 tons of biochar being produced in the United States every year. We know that's a pretty significant underestimate. And we're going to be redoing that survey or launching another round of that survey this fall. What I can tell you is that the amount of production is going up pretty rapidly right now. And it's kind of aligned with an increase in another product, which is essentially the same product, but used for a different end use, which is biocarbon.
Right.
So there's a bunch of different companies looking into biocarbon, and that's for steel manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's essentially the same product as biochar, at least wood-based biochar. And we know that there's a bunch of these facilities in the works. One of them is going to be opening this fall in Mississippi and will produce 200,000 tons of biocarbon a year. And some of those facilities, I think, will end up selling some of that material into the biochar space. So all this is just to say that the production volumes are really increasing pretty rapidly in the United States right now.
Right, no doubt. You'll have to let us know when you've completed that survey. We'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, we hope to get it launched so that it's live at our conference in Minneapolis, because then we can give out some prizes for people who actually complete it during the conference.
Perfect. Okay. So just a couple more questions for you, Myles. You'd mentioned this earlier, not all biochar is created equal. You guys are working on developing standards. Tell us more about that and why there's a need for it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the standards space in biochar, there are some existing standards. The International Biochar Initiative created some standards about 10 years ago. And those standards were very well intentioned, but they were never really created for an industry. They were mostly created by academics for academics. So it's a real challenge to get commercial laboratories to use those methods. At the same time, there are some European-based standards, but those are based on European regulations and they follow European laboratory standards, specifically German laboratory standards. So you can imagine when you approach a laboratory in the United States, even just for the analysis piece of knowing what biochar is, a lot of labs, when you show them that German standard, they'll say, well, I'm not going to implement a German laboratory standard. Like we're following US standards. So that's kind of the starting piece that USBI is tackling right now, is developing out an American national standard, an ANSI standard, that will lay out laboratory analysis methods for biochar so that at least we can get more commercial labs providing biochar analysis services so that we can get really good apples to apples comparisons between different biochars. From there, our next steps on standards are really to start working through things like end-use standards. So putting some bounds around what types of biochar can be used in soil or potting media or concrete. And then also looking at production standards, like how do we make sure that biochar production facilities are really complying with best practices? We feel like we've made some really good progress so far, and we expect that initial ANSI standard for the analysis of biochar will be released Q4 of 2025.
Okay. Well, that all makes sense. So my last question for you is, what do you think will be key to the continued growth of the U.S. biochar market?
I'll break that into two pieces. First is kind of the products side. So that's where we really focus, right? As I said, one of our major goals is developing out end-use markets. And I think one of the keys there is really focusing on productization. A lot of where the biochar industry came from was sort of a feel-good story, and the idea being that, biochar is going to save the world, therefore you should use it and buy it. Mm-hmm. We're trying to really flip that and say, hey, how do we make sure we develop biochar products and markets that benefit the end user? Because at the end of the day, that's all that really matters in terms of products and markets, is whether or not you're creating a product that benefits the end user. So as I said, we focus on really kind of developing out these markets, and we're seeing a lot of companies in the biochar space really start to see this pivot as well and really focus on products in the horticulture space, in the fertilizer space, et cetera. The other really key piece that I see in growing the US biochar industry in particular is I think about it as sort of business model innovation. And a lot of the early biochar industry similarly was sort of a feel-good story of, hey, biochar is really good, so therefore we should build these facilities and start making biochar. Some of those companies are having a hard time now because they're doing things like paying for feedstock, and they don't have a great business model around essentially leveraging the different pieces of revenue that a biochar company can make. So biochar companies can make money in these four ways. They can sell carbon credits, they can sell physical biochar, they can sell heat products or fuels, and they can sometimes get paid to take waste. And so what we're really seeing is a maturing of the business models that biochar companies are using to leverage these different revenue streams and not just focus on the biochar pieces. And we're seeing that evolve pretty quickly with a lot of companies really figuring out ways to get paid to take waste, for example. That's a big thing that we're seeing is looking for spaces where companies are currently paying to get rid of biomass waste so that biochar producers can either get it for free or in some cases even get paid to take it. So that's one that we're seeing a lot of innovation on.
Well, it's sure an exciting industry to follow right now, Myles. This has been a great discussion, fantastic insight. Is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I really appreciate you having me on. And if anybody's interested in learning more, the best place is to come to our conference in Minneapolis in September.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for coming on and sharing your insight with us. And before we sign off, I do want to plug your article that you wrote in Biomass Magazine, issue 3. It's titled More Than a Byproduct, a New Chapter for Biochar. You can access the article at biomassmagazine.com. That was Myles Gray with the USBI, and that will conclude this podcast. Thanks so much for listening.